Hi there. Since you are listening to this show, I reckon you like to learn about the overlooked parts of the human past. It so happens that I host a podcast called History of Asia. It gives you a general overview of the history of the world's largest continent, focusing on the stuff that still matters today. And rather like Michael's show, the storyline is built up in a Christopher Nolan sort of way. In fact, his movie Memento was an inspiration for my show. I believe that it's impossible to understand why ancient history remains relevant if you don't know what happens in later times. Therefore, History of Asia starts off in the present, and then it delves ever deeper into the past, systematically explaining why the topic at hand still matters. If you're interested, please check out the podcast History of Asia by Christoph Aerts. I hope to see you there. Enjoy your forgotten wars and stay safe.
I'm going to let you in on an open secret. I have no talent in mixing music or t-shirt design. I cannot do an English accent, Irish accent, or Afrikaans accent to save my life. Nor do I have the vocal range to give you the deep-voiced opening you hear at the start of each episode. The good news for me is there is always Fiverr. Fiverr.com allows you to hire freelancers for sometimes as little as $5 to do tasks that you have to get done for your business. Or sing happy birthday to your spouse in ways that are impossible for you. Or, honestly, the list could go on. Help yourself and help the show by using the link I provide in the show notes to see if Fiverr's freelancers can help you. Or if you have anything to offer Fiverr. My show was not possible without Fiverr. Some meaningful work in your life may now become possible with Fiverr. Go ahead and open the link in our show notes right now. Now, on to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
As September 1901 drew to a close, Colonel Robert Keekwich led the only British force still west of the Mahalisberg. Yes, that's the same Keekwich who ably led besieged British forces at Kimberley, until Cecil Rhodes manipulated General French into replacing Keekwich. Due to Keekwich's force being relatively isolated, Custelaret jumped at the opportunity to restock his commando's scarce ammunition by attacking Keekwich's column. Keekwich's 930 men set up camp with their 3 guns and pom-pom at the Moodvule farm, just 800 yards east of the drift in the Ceylons River. Keekwich wisely used the river and surrounding climate as a strong natural defense position, then spread a third of his force into outposts along semicircles a healthy distance from camp. Yet, somehow, depending who you ask, between 300 and 1,500 Boers, quite a variance I know, managed to cross the river below the camp on foot. General Jan Kemp led the center of this force. Basically the same Boers and the same Brits who survived the Battle of Vlakfontein 4 months before clashed early on the morning of September 30th, 1901. At 4:45 a.m., a patrol of Devon yeomanry stumbled upon part of this Boer force that snuck across the river. Shots rang out. This saved Keekwich's force from being caught completely surprised and asleep. Delaray had to make the split decision to start the full attack before the flanks of his Boer force were in position. They charged through the scrub on the right bank. This decision paid off by 5 a.m. when they overwhelmed those outposts and began firing down on Keekwich's camp before dawn fully broke. Keekwich kept his cool amidst the chaos, with men and animals scurrying around at first. He set up a defensive firing line, but sustained not 1, but 2 gunshot wounds from Boer warriors. The mounting morning light didn't spell calm at first. More Boer bullets found their British targets. The pom-pom jammed. Kuss's men destroyed some artillery pieces. British horses and mules shot down in large numbers. Some of them stampeded away. Would the Keekwich camp fall? Just after 5 a.m., Major Watts and Major Brown, on their own initiatives, led Brits not already engaged in battle in a charge against the far left of the main Boer line. About an hour later, they rushed down the river bank with fixed bayonets into the Boers and threatened to roll up the Boer line from end to end. Running short of their meager ammunition and fearing that they'd be cut off from their horses they'd left behind for the attack, the Boers completely fled by 6:15 a.m. It was over. Keekwich and company suffered about 200 casualties. The Boers, about a quarter of that. The Boers alleged 3 of their wounded met a grisly fate. Retaliation for what allegedly happened during the Battle of Vlakfontein. Here, at Moedville, Boers claimed that British soldiers either shot down 3 wounded Boers from close range or beat the wounded Boers to death with their rifle butts. The British also captured Piet Schuyl, a Dutchman they'd claimed shot at 2 British soldiers while having a white surrender flag tied to his rifle. Schuyl was tried and then executed by firing squad on October 2nd. So what happened at Vlakfontein nearly 4 months ago that neither the Boers or the Brits involved forgot? What the Boers did in this May of 1901 battle garnered both fame and infamy. Brigadier General Henry Dixon was leading a force of over 400 mounted men, about 800 infantry, and several artillery pieces, and a pom-pom on a mission. A mission to clear and burn farms southwest of Mahalisberg, and to search for any caches of rifles and ammo. Moving west from Vlakfontein on May 29th, General Dixon split his force into 3. They raided some farms, then discovered a huge cache of ammo. Before they removed all the ammo, Dixon ordered his men back to camp at Vlakfontein, with about 330 of his men to act as a rear guard. And that is when General Jan Kemp decided to pounce with his 1,500 Boers. The way they pounced was epic. What you'll hear next will not do justice to what actually happened. The scene you'll hear about next belongs in a movie.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
General Jan Kemp denied doing what you'll hear next, but the record does seem to void his denial. Jan Kemp's force took advantage of wind blowing towards the British by doing the following. Kemp and company threw gunpowder on the ground before them, lit it on fire, and then used the ensuing smokescreen to hide the size of their force. The fire quickly closed in on Dixon's rear guard. Pretorius reports what happened next. Quote, "The Boers, pressing on under cover of the fire, suddenly burst through, 500 men in all, some firing from horseback, others leading their horses and firing as they ran. The yeomanry lost heavily, and so did the darbies, who resisted bravely. However, the Boers captured the guns and were soon masters of the ridge." End quote. Then, the Boers took the guns they'd captured from Dixon's rear guard and turned them on Brits in the distance. General Dixon ordered reinforcements towards the rear guard and then rode personally towards the action. Dixon turned his remaining artillery on the Boers and sent other Brits with bayonets fixed towards Kemp's forces. At that point, Kemp and company decided to make a run for it, leaving the guns behind that they'd used briefly against Dixon. 57 Brits died from this engagement. About 120 more sustained wounds. The Boers suffered about 40 casualties. Rumors swirled afterwards in British circles that the Boers executed wounded Brits on the ridge during the battle after the Boers briefly captured those guns. One wounded Boer allegedly crawled around and finished off 3 wounded Brits before he was stopped. Whatever happened, those British who survived Vlakfontein did not forget the rumors when they faced basically the same Boers a few months later at Moedwil. The British lost more men at both Vlakfontein and Moedwil, but in a crude sense, their lives were less scarce. The Boers paid dearly for every dozen men they lost in the field. They couldn't just replace these warriors. What was worse, bleeding the British 2, 3, 4, or more times as much in these clashes didn't move the needle at all for the Boer Republic's fight for independence. A month after Moedwil, Lieutenant-Colonel-GeorgeBenson faced off against General Louis Botha in the final major battle fought in the eastern Transvaal high veld, before peace was signed. Botha returned from his aborted invasion of Natal to find that Colonel Benson also had successfully used Boer guerrilla tactics to move his columns rapidly and to capture 117 Boers in September alone. Botha and Benson faced off on October 30th. Initial news of what happened wrecked Kitchener's self-confidence. At that point, Kitchener feared for his job, no matter what confidence his superiors voiced or perhaps faked. Kitchener mournfully reported the following to Lord Roberts after the Battle of Pakenham. Quote, "The Boers observed the movements of a column from a long way off, only showing very few men, then, having chosen some advantage, in this case it was the weather, then charge in with great boldness, and the result is a serious casualty list. Benson's was one of the very best columns, and had an excellent and efficient intelligence run by Woolls-Sampson. He knew every inch of the ground, having been constantly in that part of the country. If a column like Benson's is not safe, it is a very serious matter and will require a large addition of our forces to carry on the war. What makes me most anxious is, if they can act in this way with Benson's columns, how far easier it would be for them to catch some of my less efficient columns." End quote. Some facts emerged after Kitchener sent this telegram to his boss. Facts that must have heartened Kitchener at least a little. Botha and 1,200 Boers attacked Benson's column of about 1,650 men as they crossed the Steenkool Spruit in the rain on the morning of October 30th. By afternoon, Boers surrounded Benson's defensive line. Imagine that you're Colonel Benson during this attack. For 3 hours, your men are fighting in close quarters with the Boers. You're leading your men through this chaotic defense when a Boer bullet strikes you in the knee, and another strikes you in the arm. But you don't quit. You grit your teeth and crawl up and down your defensive firing line through the mud, urging your men to fight on. Your voice doesn't waver. You just deliver commands like nothing has happened to you, until you can't anymore, because you're struck in the stomach by another Boer bullet. You think this might be over, so Colonel Woolls-Sampson takes over at about 5 p.m. Now the Boers are shooting at anything that moves on your ridge. You die the next morning, as did 77 of your 280 men who fought on Gun Hill. 161 more were wounded. The Boers only suffered 52 casualties. Kitchener is now even more convinced that he needs more than the 250,000 troops he already has at his disposal in southern Africa. But while begging for these troops, Kitchener adopted essentially what Milner had proposed months before, establishing protected areas, starting with cities like Pretoria and Bloemfontein, then working outward, like ring-shaped ripples, from those protected zones, clearing more territory of Boer rebels. By this point, Kitchener's blockhouses augmented this new strategy too, narrowing the lanes and zones where Boers could flee. Even if micromanaging Kitchener didn't coordinate the work of his more than 80 flying columns or give much more latitude to his junior commanders, the imperfect system was delivering. Though Botha and many others knew their cause was hopeless, the guerrilla war dragged on. Both Boer and British forces fell deeper into depraved brutality. Colonial troops from Australia, Canada, and South Africa, who'd earned commendation for their bravery, also gained infamy for the brutality of some. Depending who you ask, Kitchener ordered the executions of Lieutenants Breaker Morant and Peter Handcock because of their vengeful murders of several Boer prisoners of war. 1980 saw a whole movie devoted to Breaker Morant's story. Perhaps I'll do a bonus episode on him if enough of you ask. British-sanctioned executions didn't look much better at times. General French enthusiastically prosecuted Cape rebels and forced disloyal Dutch to watch these rebels be shot dead publicly in Middelburg and Dordrecht. More and more Boer warriors and civilians were waking up to how bleak and perhaps even how helpless their cause was. They knew that much of their population now were withering away in concentration camps. Boys as young as 12 had been serving on Commando since the war's beginning, but President Steyn decreed in November that 14-year-old war boys could now be conscripted. Something else troubled Boer warriors and civilians. Blacks, by and large, had sided with the British when possible. Whether blacks scouted, spied, supplied crops and livestock, sold horses or skilled labor, or increasingly during Kitchener's tenure, took up arms against the Boers. Colonel Sir Henry Rawlinson fought Boers in both the Transvaal and the Free State during this South African War. What he wrote on August 28, 1901 to Lord Roberts is haunting. Quote, "This war is fast degenerating into the same kind of dacoit hunt we used to have in Burma. The Boer is becoming just as cold-blooded a ruffian as the dacoit was, and his wholesale slaughter of Kaffirs has, I think, forfeited his right to be considered a belligerent. I found the bodies of 4 Kaffir boys, none of them over 12 years age, with their heads broken in by the Boers and left in the kraal of their fathers. Strong measures will be required to stop this slaughter." End quote. I wish I could tell you that this brutality to blacks was an isolated incident, but the truth is that Boers openly admitted to killing any armed Africans they captured. And there is far too much unpublished evidence that points to many unarmed blacks getting the gun, or worse. Canon Farmer, a prominent British missionary in the Transvaal, wrote privately about a troubling incident in 1901 involving Jan Smuts, of all people. Farmer wrote, quote, "Of all who have suffered by the war, those who have endured the most and will receive least sympathy are the natives in the country places of the Transvaal. They have welcomed British columns, and when these columns have marched on, the natives have been compelled to flee from the Boers, abandon most of their cattle and stuff, and take refuge in the towns or fortified places, or be killed. I have been asking after my people, and this is the account I get of them all. For instance, at Vlakfontein, one of my strongest centers of church work in the Transvaal, there was placed a garrison of 200 white men, the natives, all of whom I knew were there in their village. The Boers under Smuts captured this post last month, and then afterwards, a British column visited the place. They found the bodies of all the Kaffirs murdered and unburied. I should be sorry to say anything that is unfair about the Boers. They look upon the Kaffirs as dogs, and killing of them as hardly a crime." End quote. I wish I could tell you that it was just a few Transvaal Boers who brutalized blacks, but that wouldn't be true either. Blacks who took up arms or resisted Boers in the Cape faced much more peril towards the beginning and middle of the war. 45-year-old Abraham Esau came from Cape Colony's town of Calvinia. This colored man, remember, colored in this context means he came from a mixed-race lineage. This colored man led local resistance to Boer rebels. Boers, led by Commandant T.K. Nieuwoud, rolled into Calvinia in January 1901. Field Cornet C. van der Merwe assumed leadership as the Lantroost of Calvinia. Boers dragged Abraham Esau before the new authorities for the crime of speaking against the Boer Republicans and trying to arm the town's natives. For these crimes, Abraham Esau earned 25 lashes and arrest. Esau fell unconscious while being brutally lashed. What was worse, the Boers weren't finished with Esau. They beat him in public several more times, but the Boers lost their grip on Calvinia before long, as they prepared to evacuate the town in the face of an overpowering British force. The Boers didn't neglect to drag Esau in leg irons until he waited helplessly between two horses. Those Boers tied him between the two horses and dragged him further to a secluded area outside town and shot Esau dead. Colored people quite understandably made a martyr out of Esau afterwards. The British made sure to use this incident to fuel further outrage back in Britain against the Boers. Some Calvinia whites were enraged when British authorities allowed black witnesses to testify against Esau's perpetrators. This outrage of allowing these black savages to testify against Boer perpetrators in Esau's killing and other cases during the war sometimes led to further backlash against blacks. But as the British drove war commandos out of the Cape Colony over and over again, blacks grew more and more bold. Black and colored corps arose throughout the Cape Colony, often armed by the British. These included militias like the Namaqualand Scouts, Bushman Land Borderers, and Northern Border Scouts. As if the blockhouse system wasn't already squeezing commandos enough, these armed blacks squeezed the commandos some more. Blacks didn't only rise up in the Cape Colony. Nasson writes, quote, "As if to add to a sense of impending doom, back in Boer territory, groups of rural African tenants were taking up the habit of armed threat or violence in disturbingly large numbers. They began occupying lands across many areas, particularly in the Transvaal, spurning customary master and servant or landlord and tenant relationships. Boers obviously resisted moves to contest their authority and ownership, but as hostilities wore on, many began to lose all ability to act and even faith in their strength. So extensive was this decomposition and so intense the Boer African belligerence to which it gave rise, one historian has characterized it as the eruption of a ragged peasant war or a rebellion from below. Without exaggerating its influence as a force behind Republican defeat, African resistance and collaboration with the imperial occupation certainly played its part in pushing the Boers to surrender." End quote. Some commandos didn't help themselves when they helped themselves to whatever increasingly scarce supplies that they could get their hands on in Zulu or other African homesteads. Remember Roberts and now Kitchener burned Republican farms down to the point that the Boers had few options for supplying themselves. I think many of us can understand stealing food in desperation, but I also think most of us can understand taking issue with your home, your village, being pillaged by armed people who often have treated you pretty poorly to begin with. Blacks responded to these raids by informing on Boer raiders as soon as British pursuers showed up. Some took revenge into their own hands. For example, some Zulus took matters into their own hands in April of 1902 near Vryheid. Boers operating here confiscated food, and even forced Zulu to perform manual labor for them. Zulus bearing spears descended on a small commando encampment at Olokrans on one April evening. The surprise commando shot about 100 warriors down, but not before these Zulus speared 56 Boers to death. Botha remarked afterward about the losing cycle his men were trapped in. The only way his commandos in the Transvaal could feed themselves was by stealing food. The more food they stole, the more enemies they created. Missionary stations presented attractive targets, even if armed defenders patrolled them. Canon Farmer provided you one account at the top of this episode, but that was not an isolated incident. Now you heard that Canon Farmer alleged that it was Jan Smuts's Boers who murdered many blacks at his mission station. What happened at a Methodist mission station at Vlakfontein in Namaqualand sickened Deneys Reitz and likely angered Jan Smuts, at least according to historian Peter Warwick. Independent peasants and those fleeing work on neighboring Afrikaner farms worked around this mission station and provided military labor to the British. One day in early 1902, S.G. Maurits and a few Boers tried to gain intelligence from white missionaries at the station when armed natives attacked. Deneys Reitz reports that the next day, quote, "To avenge the insult, Maurits returned the next morning with a stronger force and wiped out the settlement, which seemed to many of us a ruthless and unjustifiable act. We found the place sacked and gutted, and, among the rocks beyond the burned houses, lay 20 or 30 dead Hottentots, still clutching their antiquated muzzle-loaders. This was Maurits's handiwork. General Smuts said nothing, but I saw him walk past the boulders where the dead lay, and on his return he was moody and curt, as was his custom when displeased. We lived in an atmosphere of rotting corpses for some days." End quote. Those blacks who survived the attack were then forced to work at nearby white farms. On Christmas Eve 1901, Christian de Wet set a trap. De Wet deceived Major Williams's nearly 500 isolated Brits on the Groenkop hilltop into thinking that no Boers roamed this area of the Orange Free State. De Wet's 500 men ascended the hill from 3 sides and surprised the British on the summit early that Christmas morning. Major Williams died during the ensuing clash. The Boers' expanding bullets ripped apart many a face and stomach. Before sunrise, the Boers had their Christmas gifts and De Wet his final victory before the war was over. Williams's column suffered over 140 casualties, and the Boers took most of the rest prisoners, for a limited time only. The prisoners must have been disoriented when their captors were rounding them up and stripping them of spare clothes. Many of these bearded, rifle-wielding Boer captors were wearing bonnets and dresses, because those were all the clothes they could come by after theirs wore out. After stripping many of these Brits, the Boers quickly ejected the prisoners across the Basotho-land border. In addition to getting to ditch their dresses and bonnets, De Wet and company bagged vast quantities of ammunition and supplies, as well as 500 horses, all at the cost of 14 Boers killed in this battle of Groenkop. But did this victory matter in the end? I think you already know. All his complaints aside, Kitchener's forces kept growing while Boer forces kept diminishing. Less than 20,000 Boers operated in the field, outnumbered more than 10-1. Plus, Kitchener kept arming blacks. He eventually confessed to Parliament of arming over 10,000 across southern Africa. What was more, the British Field Intelligence Department emerged in southern Africa as a dominant force. When Lord Roberts left for England the previous year, less than 300 whites worked in this department. By December 1901, nearly 2,500 whites worked in this department and were aided along by thousands of Africans gathering intelligence in the field. The Colonel Woolls-Sampson you heard about previously performed so well as the field officer for one column that it captured 300 of the 756 Boers who fell into British hands in just the 2nd and 3rd weeks of December alone. Woolls-Sampson so eagerly led that he paid African scouts out of his own pocket. Kitchener had wanted to fire this guy months ago, but now the colonel was a star. And the work of men like this star colonel suffocated the Boers' war effort. The final chapter of our season is next week. That means a lot of things. That means there's a limited time to get me any questions that you have about these wars and topics that we've covered over the course of this past several months. That also means that if any of you were still considering supporting the show at all, I would really appreciate it if you did that in the next couple of weeks before the show is off for the season. The final thing that I would really appreciate, especially for those of you who do not have the means to support the show financially, is that you would continue to share the show. Preferably either episode 1.3 or 1.1 that gets people started from the beginning of our story. Take care, everybody.